Who are the people who hike the Pacific Crest Trail? Other than me and Liz, who did it 20 years ago. What's their typical age, gender, educational background? How many foreigners, like me? What about their planning? Do they train? Why choose southbound over northbound? Which direction is most likely to succeed? And most fascinating, what advice would they pass on to this year's hikers? Statistics to help answer these questions and many, many more are contained in the Hiker Survey, which a PCT hiker, trail name Mac, has been compiling for 10 years. If you haven't signed up and you plan to or are hiking the PCT, head to halfwayanywhere.com and get your name down to take part in the current survey. There's a link in the show notes. Mac is probably away hiking right now, but you can catch up with him on Instagram. I'll try to break this podcast into digestible chunks rather than a blizzard of statistics. And we'll start with his first PCT hike that helped inspire the survey.
My two PCT hike experiences are very different from one another because one was done when I had zero backpacking experience, and the PCT was still, relative to what it is now, kind of unknown. That's the one I'll focus on, because that's also the one the survey came out of. That was 2013.
Oh, right. So it's just when Wild was coming out.
Yeah. So the book was out and the movie was being filmed. And like, it was funny because everybody was like, oh, they're filming the movie like in so-and-so place. Like everybody had some wrong idea about where they were filming the movie along the trail. But I mean, it had already started to, I knew people in 2013 who said, I'm hiking the PCT this year because of Wild, the book. So it was already getting people out onto the trail. When I hiked it in 2013, like I said, it really wasn't as well known. So there wasn't like this wealth of information online about it. There was a couple like people's accounts of things that you should do or whatever, but I was always kind of frustrated by the fact that it's like just one person's interpretation of what's going on. And, you know, there's so many different kinds of people on the trail that, you know, what might be the objectively best thing for me is going to be the objectively worst thing for someone else. And just like when to start, that was like a really big question mark. And I just thought it would be cool to kind of get as much information from as many hikers on the trail as I could, and then put it all together and kind of find the quote unquote average PCT hike for the year. And that's kind of what got the survey started. And I had a good response the first year, like based on me being me and not knowing anything much about like the internet and collecting responses. And
well, you're handing out flyers as you go, or how are you getting in touch with them and ask them, could you fill us in what's going on there?
Initially, it was just me messaging people who I had met on the trail, just, you know, personal friends of mine. And then there was a PCT Facebook group that I used. And then, believe it or not, I don't remember if I used it or not, but one of like the big resources that would come up if you were like trying to research the PCT back in, you know, 2012, 2013 was the PCT listserv.
Oh, I remember that. Oh, yeah. I remember that from here in Scotland. That was the source of information.
So that was like a big thing. And I can't remember if I like tried to put out a message on the listserv or not, but I'd completely forgot about that. That just goes to show you how far the PCT has come as far as the resources available.
The survey, how is it done now, though? Because if anybody's setting off in 2023 and happen to be listening to this, good luck to you, then what do they need to know to take part and share their experience this year? So
I have a sign-up form on the website that people can sign up for. Basically, submit your email now to receive the survey when it's released. I typically release it in the fall, but I might start doing it earlier because usually all of the updates that I make immediately following the previous year's survey, because that's when I get most of the feedback and that's when everything's freshest in my mind. So I have people go on the website and sign up, distribution just via all my social media channels. And then something else that I've started doing is trying to coordinate with some local businesses along the trail, like especially pinch points where it's kind of everybody goes through, and try to have like a sign up sheet there for people, because especially earlier on in the trail, because one of the things that I found is that the survey data skews heavily towards people who have finished the trail, which is good in some regards because there's questions that only those people who hiked the whole trail can answer that somebody who only hiked part of the trail couldn't answer. But I want the data from everybody because it would be great to find out more about, why people didn't finish the trail or where people got off or what happened. Or that's always something that I struggle with, is trying to, get the people who stopped hiking in April interested in doing the survey in, September.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that struck me, and I'd forgotten all about this, was how many registers. This is back in 20 years ago. How many registers there were along the trail, and we got fed up of filling them all in. Is that still the situation? Are there still all this ton of registers to go, and is this something on top of it, or has this more or less taken over from that? Because at the kickoff we met Meadow Ed. He described himself as a trail statistician, and I suspect that mantle might have passed to you, Mac.
They definitely exist independently of one another, because the registers, the ones that you're talking about, the ones that are just like at a trailhead.
They're
at
trailheads. They're in post offices. Some stores have them, and there were times we'd hit a town and we could fill in 3 registers, and you weren't too sure which was the one you ought to be filling in if you really want to be counted.
Yeah, so I mean, the registers still exist, more of like a kind of legacy thing. It's just like more of like a trail culture thing more than anything for people to fill it in. Like as far as being counted, like, people really are taking at their word whether or not they actually hiked it all. And the registers definitely also, at least I don't remember seeing as many in 2019 as 2013, but they're definitely more heavily concentrated towards the beginning of the trail. I feel like at least the physical ones, like out on the trail, like of course there's still like businesses or post offices who will have them occasionally, but
there's obviously more hikers now. And in part of the series, I'm trying to get a handle on how that experience has changed. And you mentioned earlier about technology having changed things, the PCTL as was, and there are now more apps. Do you find that there's almost too much data and it's kind of diluted across too many sources? I mean, even looking at your website, there's such a slew of data on there. It's kind of, I'm not criticizing it, but it's hard to know where to begin. And you think of all the other things out there, the myriad Facebook groups too.
Really, it's like for those who are more enthusiastic about planning things. And I guess if you're coming at it from, I've never done this before and I have no idea what to do or where to start, kind of the more data, the more research that you do ahead of time, the more prepared you'll feel like you are. And I typically tell people, I was actually just talking to a friend of a friend yesterday who's going to hike the trail this year. And she was all concerned about all of her planning and all of this. And like one of my biggest pieces of advice was like, you can just like shut out 90% of what you're looking at and worrying about right now, because none of that's going to actually be helpful or applicable to you once you're actually on the trail. And it might be fun and it might make you feel good about planning it right now, but it's kind of, I don't know the term for it, but it's like the more information that becomes available about the PCT has grown equally in popularity and like being known. So you almost don't need that information that's now available to you because the PCT becomes like a bigger thing. And now there are businesses along the trail who are hyper aware of the hikers and cater to the hikers. So you really don't have to worry about getting anything done ahead of time besides knowing where your next resupply stop is going to be. Because when you get there, you can be sure that there's going to be a way to get to town. There's going to be a way for you to resupply. There's going to be somewhere for you to stay. It's not this thing where you're just like in the backcountry and need to organize like a bush plane to come and drop you a package of food or something. It really is, as long as you can walk from the trailhead at one road to the trailhead at another road, 50, 60, 100 miles away, then that's all you really have to plan for on the PCT nowadays, I feel like.
Let's dive into some of the data, but can I just get clear of the response numbers you had? Because a lot of this is in percentages. So how many are we talking about in the early days, and roughly how many responses are you getting? Say to the last one, to the 2022.
So I think my earliest survey, the very first one, I had maybe like 100 and something people who responded to it. And it's I lost the raw data for the very first survey, which makes me sad. I still have the aggregate data that I posted, but I was just using like, I don't even remember what platform to collect the responses, but I now use something different. But yeah, I say over 100 people. So I'll assume that that's somewhere closer to 100 than 150. In 2022, I had, I think, 953 people fill it out. So
That's a lot.
yeah, it's definitely increased significantly from that first survey.
Do the PCTA incidentally use any of this data? Because I'd imagine, and they got funding based on the information they got in the trail registers. I'd imagine this would be very useful to them.
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually live in Sacramento now, where the PCTA is based, and I've talked to people at the PCTA, and they're aware of the survey. They don't officially endorse the survey, which I think is more just like a bureaucratic thing than anything else. Because I've talked to them in the past and said, hey, what would be great is, since you have the contact information of every person who had got a PCT permit, if you distributed the survey for me or helped me distribute it, that would really go far as,
or even ask them to get in touch with you with a permit. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. But I mean, I've basically been flat out told no multiple times. So, I mean, maybe one day, but as long as, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, and it'd be nice, but certainly isn't necessary, obviously, to collect responses from hikers.
That's the background. Let's try to use Mac's figures to understand who is hiking the PCT now, starting with age, race, and gender. It struck me that many more of the hikers were female than 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's typically a pretty even split. I feel like there's typically like a couple percentage points more. I mean, probably within the margin of error, male hikers than female hikers, but it's a pretty even split typically. And I mean, from my own experience, both times I've been out on the trail, it's been fairly even. Like, there definitely hasn't been on the Continental Divide Trail in 2017. There was definitely more male hikers than female hikers on the trails. That was fairly obvious. But on the PCT, I didn't really have that same experience.
We are just guessing here, okay? But I wonder whether that is a reaction to the Cheryl Strayed book and film as well.
It definitely could be. It's, I mean, I don't know. When you said when you hiked, it was more heavily male and female, you're saying?
I'm certain of it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I wouldn't say we're not talking like 90-10 or something, but we're talking probably 70-30. That would be based on my own personal experience and my recollection from 20 years ago. But I found it very difficult, though, when we looked up the next thing about age as well. I couldn't tell you the demographic age spread, as it were, across the year that I did it. But here it seems to be 25 to 29 is your main group from 2022. Yeah.
And, from my own experience too, I do feel like you typically mostly people in their 20s, and then people in like, I don't know, 50 plus almost, and you're kind of missing that 30 to 50. And my armchair reasoning was like, oh, that must be when people are like having children, and so they can't hike the PCT. But,
or knuckling down with work and, just getting on with it. And when some people retire early in their 50s, so
yeah. Kind of, at least to be like a very clear, there was like the young people and the old people, and the old people were 60 plus, and the young people were all like fresh out of school. And it didn't, at least used to be like a very big thing. It was, everybody was still an equal, everybody was still friends out there. I think nowadays it's a little more cliquey out on the trail, but yeah, definitely the old young split with like the valley in the middle,
and mostly white, overwhelmingly white.
Overwhelmingly white, yeah. And that's this year, 90.7% of hikers, I mean, from my data, were white, which means 10% of hikers weren't. But I mean, it's still overwhelmingly white, and that's what it's been since I hiked in 2013 as well.
And looking at this, again, 47% have got a bachelor's degree. and again, 78% heterosexual. It's very difficult not to bring up a position where you think about the main hikers being people, young people who have left college, university, and maybe had just had a little bit of a job and then are doing this while they're kind of trying to sort out what they really want to do with their lives. I know it's a huge generalization, but you kind of, I'm getting that picture, and I don't have the experience to back it up. So I'm wondering if I'm right or whether I'm just
no. I mean, it's honestly the data is not frustrating to me sometimes, but it's like, I'm just, come on, because literally what you described and literally what the data represents was exactly me when I hiked the PCT the first time. Like, I'm like, oh, I'm a white, straight, 20-something male from California with a bachelor's degree who is, just going out on the trail because don't really know what else to do and trying to figure it out. Like,
yeah, I was aware of the the white middle class decent job degree privilege when I was hiking, but without necessarily quite the range spread. But most were solo, and most who started with someone stayed with them. So that kind of surprised me, actually. There was not too many bust ups.
I don't know. People worry about starting solo, but it really is the way to do it, especially if you're not doing it like with like your partner or something, because to try to stick with somebody who you might not have spent, 24 hours a day every day with before is introducing another variable that could potentially lead to a lot of not good times on the hike. So yeah, I mean, every year there's a couple of people who report starting in a relationship and then ending the trail not in a relationship with the person that was their hiking partner. So the trail,
that's got to be difficult.
Yeah, it definitely ruins some. And I even know people. I have a good friend who, hiked the whole trail with his partner, and they split up in Washington, I think somewhere. But I think it's also a great test of our relationship. Like if you can finish a through hike with somebody, like that means you're pretty rock solid, and you guys can get through a lot together.
Well, I'd been in a relationship for a couple of years when we did our hike, and we got married shortly afterwards, and we're still together, and that's 20 years on. So I think you're right. It's
there you go. All right.
A critical test to destruction. Has the typical hiker changed in the years you've been doing this survey?
So according to the data I have, in 2019, and I want to do this again this year because this year all I've had 10 years worth of data, but in 2019, I looked at the 7 previous years of data to kind of try to compare how things had changed. And the most interesting thing about the data is probably the fact that it's remained relatively the same, at least according to the data that I have. So the one thing that has changed a little bit, at least from my data, is that in 2016, the percentage of international hikers jumped up from around 15% to 30%. And I think that has held true through this year as well. Yeah, this year we had almost 40% international hikers. So I think that's the one thing that has changed a lot is, man, maybe that's a symptom of there being more information available now. So people overseas can feel a little more confident. But I mean, I'm guessing you came from overseas as well,
yeah,
or were you already
absolutely.
living here?
No, we very much came from overseas, and I would maybe look at the rate of the dollar against the euro.
That could be one as well, yeah.
Although last year, I think the dollar was incredibly strong. So, but by then you've kind of committed. You've committed to planning, and off you go.
Yeah,
and also so many people. Probably, I don't know if these last year and this coming year will be typical, because so many people had such a shakeup, didn't they, during COVID, and we were all kind of like got this blast of mortality headed our way, and we suddenly went, crikey, we better do the thing we've always wanted to do, because who knows what's around the corner, and and so I think maybe that skews a little bit of the figures going forward. I don't know.
Yeah, it's always hard to know exactly what or why things turn out a certain way, and they might be buried in the data, and there might be a question I could start asking, but
Yeah.
I'm just me. Every year I have people who reach out to me and offer to help with the data, and every year those offers of help ultimately fizzle out into those people just ghosting me. So I do as much as I can on my own.
Yeah, that's statistics though. Always raise more questions than answers.
Exactly.
Now we know who, how about how? How do people hike the trail? And to begin with, how much planning do they do? I'm a fan of test hikes, testing equipment, and in 2002 we prepared all our boxes before we started. But we had done quite a few multi-day hikes and mountaineering expeditions. What do Mac's statistics reveal about planning?
You really don't realize that when you're hiking, on your 10th day out on the trail, all you're going to be worried about is where your next water source is, or where you're going to camp, or when's the next time you're going to eat. Like, you don't care about the length of the socks in the box that you're sending to yourself at the first resupply stop in Washington and 2,000 miles. Like, that information, it doesn't matter how much you planned it, like, is not useful or important or relative to anything that's going on. So the one piece of planning advice I try to push on people is not to plan as much as they think they need to plan, or at least like to invest that time into something like saving more money, or doing a hike with your backpack and the shoes and the socks that you're going to be wearing on the trail, because those are things that will actually translate into being helpful on the trail. I mean, unless you've really got a serious dietary restriction, or are on a serious time crunch, or have some logistical thing that makes your situation very specific, there's really not a need to spend all that time planning. And like I said, some people enjoy the planning part even more so than the actual hike. I'm planning for a hike right now, and I'm definitely over planning for it, but it's also, I enjoy the planning process of it. I'm going to be out on the trail, and I'm sure a lot of the stuff that I've planned is just going to be completely useless and will have been a waste of time. But me now feels better about me in the future having done all of these things. So, I mean, I understand, but
it's reassuring.
It is. It definitely is.
You kind of move into it and you feel more.
Yeah, and it's hard to take people at their word, because I'm guilty of this too. Like, I remember in 2013, there was people who said to me, like, you don't need to do this, or you don't need to carry this, or this or that. And I was kind of the opinion that, no, I think I know what I'm doing. And then, couple thousand miles later, I was like, oh, you know what? That person, they knew what they were talking about. I should have listened to them. But, some things you just have to experience for yourself to really, appreciate it.
Let's talk about your big choice, northbound or southbound, because when we did it 20 years ago, there was very, very few southbound hikers. Now it's a very realistic choice with a high success rate.
It is a real choice. It's still overwhelmingly northbound hikers, and it's kind of become even more of like a meta thing. Like, it's not a logistical thing for a lot of people. It's just become like, oh, northbound is the way that you hike the trail, which, obviously you can hike in either direction, but there is this kind of false sense of rivalry or competition between northbound and southbound hikers. And it's almost as if you meet somebody who hiked the PCT southbound and you've hiked it northbound, it's like you don't relate to them at all. It's like they've hiked a completely different trail than you, which in some regards, like, you could make a case it's true, but it also is, I don't know. And it's like when they're crossing each other on the trail, there's like tension between the northbound hikers and the southbound hikers. Like, I remember in 2013, it was like a mantra, like, never trust a southbounder. Like, they'll always give you wrong information. Like, they just started their hikes, like one state ago, and we've hiked through California and Oregon. I don't know. It's a weird dynamic that exists between the northbounders and the southbounders, and it shouldn't. And I wish it didn't, because I mean, and also nowadays the southbounders end up not hating, but being incredibly annoyed by northbounders, because imagine you're a southbound hiker and you're passing just, hundreds, if not thousands of people every couple of days. And it's when they're like passing through the northbound bubble, it must just be, I'm the kind of person that talks to everybody on the trail and says hi to everybody. But I can imagine if I was seeing 100 people a day, and each one of those interactions was going to take, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, like, that's a lot of time to just spend being friendly and chatting to people.
Do they give reasons for their decisions to do, the direction they go? And I'm wondering why the southbounders choose to do it that way, the southbounders, given the kind of like the proper way that many people now think of it as northbound.
Yeah, so I asked southbound hikers, and I feel like I should ask northbound hikers too, now that I think of it. But I asked southbound hikers specifically why they chose to hike southbound. And typically it's because of the timing working better for people. So people will begin a northbound hike in April or May typically, and they'll finish in like August, September.
Mm-hmm.
And then but meanwhile, you don't begin a southbound hike typically until like early July or late June because of all the snow in Washington. And then you can finish a southbound hike as, I was actually at the southern terminus in December of this year, almost or of last year, close to the end of the year, and met a group of 4 or 5 hikers who were finishing. So, I mean, you can finish as late as December, but typically people will finish sometime in October, November. For a southbound hike. So, just based on work or school or whatever somebody has going on in their life, southbound logistically could be just the obvious choice for them as far as, being able to make a PCT through hike happen.
But 54% of them are saying to avoid crowds. So I wonder whether that's not only the campsite competition, but also towns, because I imagine the town experience has changed a little bit too for the northbounders. So I wonder if there's something to do with that as well.
Avoiding crowds is a real thing. I mean, obviously you have to deal with the crowd that is the northbound bubble passing you, but I think, typically you'll be a lot more on your own in a lot of the areas of the trail because not a lot of people hiking, early season up in Washington and in the snow, and then by the time you get to the Sierra, it's already, past the height of summer. So you're not going to have all the John Muir Trail hikers out there as well. Or even just the people out because school's not in session. So like I said, there is the case to be made that it is a much different hike, from a northbound hike. But, I mean, eventually the, number of people going southbound might match the number of people going northbound. Who knows? So, the crowds might just be an issue regardless of which direction you're hiking.
Flip-flopping becomes quite a thing now with fires, doesn't it?
Yeah, flip-flopping is sad. I am not a huge proponent of flip-flopping.
We better define that actually.
Yeah, so flip-flopping is basically, let's say you're hiking the trail northbound. A flip-flop would be a typical situation is you get to Kennedy Meadows, which is the unofficial start of the Sierra Nevada, and you say to yourself, oh, there's way too much snow. And this is actually a bad example because this isn't something that's allowed to happen on a PCT permit anymore. Logistically, it's a little more complicated, but just for the sake of this explanation, we'll say you get to Kennedy Meadows, you decide there's too much snow, and so you flip-flop. And the flip is you say go up to the Oregon border, and then you hike southbound to Lake Tahoe. And then the flop is you go back to Kennedy Meadows, and then you hike northbound to Lake Tahoe. And you can hike in any direction after flip-flopping. It basically just means you're moving from one part of the trail to another part of the trail, hiking another part of the trail, and then either returning to that original place that you left or hiking back to that original place that you left and kind of making up those miles later on. And that can happen because of weather, because of fires, because of, just personal logistical reasons. A whole bunch of different reasons for flip-flopping exist.
But it looks at your statistics there, 82.6% had to do it because of fire. Or
yeah.
of those who did flip-flop, 82.6% did it because of fire.
And that was last year, because last year there were some really significant fires. Like in 2019, the last time I was out on the PCT, that number was much more heavily in favor of snow. So it definitely, but fire and snow are typically the two biggest reasons, because those are kind of the two things, especially fire, is you can't do anything about it. You're forced to either skip that section of the trail completely or just flip-flop, because, if the trail's closed, what are you going to do? I mean, you could wait maybe a day, maybe a month, maybe 2 months for the fire closure to lift. But, that's not always a very practical decision.
Although we should say that only 22% of through hikers actually did flip flop last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And because a lot of people might just skip the fire closure and then not go back and hike it. Some people might say they flip flopped if they skipped the fire closure, hiked to the finish, and then, came back to wherever that fire closure was to hike it after they finished the trail. And, logistically and financially, that can be a burden for a lot of people, to all of a sudden make your way back to the middle of Northern California somewhere on the trail and to hike those miles that you missed because of the fire. So a lot of people, I think, will just miss a section of trail and say, well, that's just not part of my PCT through hike this year.
This leads us to ask, what is a successful through hike? What if you skipped whole sections for whatever reason, hitchhiked or took the bus? Can you claim to have done a through hike in MAC statistics and the ones held by the Pacific Crest Trail Association?
The safest, most general definition of a successful through hike is whatever you define as a successful through hike. But you aren't wrong in saying that like there has arisen a kind of complication around like what is a through hike, and not just in the sense of like what is through hiking the PCT, but what is a through hike in general? Like, if I did a day hike of this 30-mile trail, like, is that a through hike or did I just go on a regular hike? But leaving that aside, so I mean, there's people who are known as purists, and those are people who believe you have to walk a unbroken footpath of the entire trail for that to count as a through hike. So if you hitchhike into town, when you hitchhike back to where you left the road, you better step exactly where you stepped when you got into that car to make sure your steps aren't unbroken. And, if there's a fire closure, you better find a way to walk roads or walk something around that fire closure. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a through hike. But then you'll have other people, who are like, you know what, if there's a fire closure, I'm not going to walk 200 miles on a highway to, connect my footsteps. My through hike is still a successful through hike if I make it to the border. Everybody has their own opinion. And, it's probably more like a spectrum than anything, because then there's other people who, will hitchhike from town to town and skip massive sections of trail. And then, they'll end up at the northern terminus or the southern terminus. And, they'll say, well, I hiked the PCT or I through hiked the PCT. And you'll have other people who are hiking who are like, well, no, you didn't, because you hitchhiked a bunch. And so it's, honestly, eventually it just becomes like, well, who cares? It's a hike. If somebody wants to say they hiked, like, okay, they hiked, whatever. Like, who cares? There's no,
it's not the
like
Olympics.
real world. Yeah. There's no like implications for it beyond what that person says. So the PCTA, it was helpful because they used to release statistics on when you finish the trail, you can submit your information to the PCTA, and they have like a finishers list, I believe. I don't know if they still have it anymore.
There's a drop down thing on their website, and we're not on it, actually. We are not on, even though I filled in the register at the border. But, so there's 136 on their list finished in 2002.
They hadn't updated this in a while, and I thought they had stopped, but yeah, they started updating it again. And so I'm seeing for 2022, 807 completions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, I meant 2002 for mine. Beg your pardon. I was meaning.
Sorry. 2022. No, you were right. I just got confused with all the twos and zeros.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Okay, no. So yeah, this is information I actually used to use, and then they hadn't updated it in a while, but it looks like they've updated it now. So yeah, 807 completions according to the PCTA in 2022, and then.
But quite a similar sort of percentages. I'm just doing it very roughly in my head. If we had about 300 and around 137, give or take, 140, let's say, finished in my year 20 years ago, and now you've got between 64% and 78% finishing, there's actually been an increase in the percentage that are finishing, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, and I would probably assume a lot of that has to do with how well known the trails become, the resources available, the towns catering to hikers, the the gear that I'm sure has changed significantly in the last 20 years, just as far as being lighter, waterproof, or more functional, or, nowadays, if you have a phone, it's fairly easy to navigate the PCT. You're not needing to have paper maps and a compass at all times, figuring out where to go next. It's a pretty well-defined trail, and you don't have to be an orienteer to find your way down the PCT.
To be fair, it was never really like that. The maps, we just pulled the sections out of the guidebook and used those, and that was fine. I do like, however, the advice sections. The advice sections that are in here are utterly amazing, completely contradictory, but both options valid. And it really does. It really does this emphasize to me, just reading through them. And I would urge anybody thinking of doing the PCT, even if you don't really want to get snowblind with statistics, is to have a good look at those advice sections, because it emphasizes this hike your own hike thing. And you could actually almost do a book of that advice.
Yeah, no, I mean, the advice is, and it is funny because there is contradictory advice all the time. And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, anything you hear from one individual person, you need to remember that's just that person's experience. And
absolutely,
it could be completely different as far as you're concerned. But the biggest piece of it is advice are always, like you said, hike your own hike. Like, don't try to be out there for anybody but yourself. And then just really be flexible, be adaptable. Things aren't going to go the way you planned, even if you did plan every single aspect of your hike. It's impossible to know how many miles a day you are going to be walking between the California border and the first resupply stop in Oregon when you're sitting at your house, 6 months before, having never walked on the trail. So adaptability is definitely a huge piece of advice that I see year after year. The PCT is great, but it's also, you're going to have a lot of bad times as well, and I ask people about their scariest or lowest moments on the trail. Those I think are really valuable to read because, it's easy to be all excited about it and, just see beautiful pictures and videos and everything. But
what are their low times and their scary times? Because they're not necessarily the same things.
No, I mean, a lot of people's, the low moments on the trail range from people finding out that like a family member had died back home, which is, something that you don't even think about being something that can happen to you on the trail. But, that could easily, end somebody's through hike, to people dropping their backpack into a river and getting all of their, clothes and sleeping bag and everything completely soaked, and then having to walk out of the mountains and get to a town because, they couldn't stay warm. And then, scary moments on the trail. Unfortunately, there's a lot of scary moments that revolve around other people, and it's typically people in town. A lot of people like to say, oh, the trail is the safest place to be on the trail, because people have fears of animals if they haven't spent a lot of time in the backcountry. But on the PCT, you really have no animals to worry about other than maybe like mice getting into your food bag. A PCT hiker, as far as I know, has never been killed by an animal. And the last time somebody on the PCT, or the last time somebody on the West Coast, I feel like, was killed by a bear or a mountain lion, it was a long time ago. And it was like probably a child. Those are like the things that are right in front of you. But, people are scared of lightning every year. I'm scared of lightning. Lightning's scary when you're out in the mountains.
But I'll tell you my scary one. Random gunfire in the woods.
Yep.
Sunday afternoon, because we come from Scotland. The people around here have occasional guns when they're shooting deer, and that's about it. But Sunday afternoon, they've had a good lunch that's come out of quite a few cans, and you just hear rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and you don't know if it's coming your way. And, oh man, that's scary. Yeah,
no, every year, because you go through Oregon typically right as hunting season is starting, so right when people are allowed to just get out there with their guns. So it's
and bows,
yeah. And I've personally accidentally snuck up on some hunters before, and I'm always like, aren't you supposed to be the ones sneaking up on things out here? But it's I mean, I'm from the US. I mean, I don't have a gun, but yeah, gunfire when you're just by yourself in the woods, especially if, you're not used to it or you don't know where it's coming from or which direction it's going, is definitely a little disconcerting.
I'd urge you to check out Mac's website, where all the data is compiled and all the advice. It's halfwayanywhere.com, and there you'll find links to his Instagram, because Mac is probably in the middle of a long hike when you hear this. Details are all in the show notes, along with a link to buy me a virtual coffee. Just a couple of dollars as a way of saying thank you because you're enjoying this podcast series. I put the money towards the hosting and production costs. Find all that at pctpodcast.com, and there you'll also find a link to buy a download of our 2002 Trail Journal. I'm Simon Willis. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.